Just want to introduce our procedure and also make an initial comment that at the conclusion of this session, our three authors have a date with a public broadcasting system camera, and so we'll have to leave the stage here very quickly. Please help us meet our requirements. First, I would, as our procedure has developed here, we'll turn to our two other distinguished authors to see if they want to make some comments about Mr. Styron's talk.
I'm here, and I was glad I was here to hear Mr. Styron deliver a very sobering, very moving commentary on two events. I'm close to speechless with reverence for him and the intelligence and industry he just brought to me.
Thank you. Yeah, well, my situation's peculiar because I'm going to have to speak this afternoon, and I'm not going to speak that well.
Okay. I'm going to turn to our discussion panel and then also turn a little later in the morning to the audience for questions from you as well. Professor Roeder?
I'm reminded that Shaw has Caesar on the roof of the palace saying, "Thus violence begets violence and murder begets murder until the gods create a race of men who can understand." You referred to thousands of innocent human beings. Disregarding the concept perhaps of original sin, are there such things as innocent human beings? We're all witness not only to Auschwitz and Hiroshima, but also to Rwanda and Bosnia. The list is almost endless. Perhaps Thomas Malthus is right. War is one of the major controllers of the excess growth of human population. I don't think it's a happy view, but would you think it's a wrong view?
I think the word innocent is a figure of speech. It meant, I certainly didn't mean that in any ethically oriented way. I meant it only that the victims of the bombs in Japan were helpless. Were helpless bystanders. And I certainly didn't want to make a connection with, at that moment, with Rwanda or any of the other atrocities that have taken place on the planet.
Dr. Wilson? It says it did. You don't have to.
Yeah, well, I don't think I could be heard yesterday. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was tremendously impressed by your speech, and I would say that in Britain your opinion is followed absolutely. I had a cousin who was 6 years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, and we feel absolutely, I think everybody in Britain does, feel the same way you do. So I was amazed at this late business with the Enola Gay. But I had prepared a question to ask you concerning your work that I had read, and it is this. You mention Rilke quite often, and he wrote a line, "Beauty's nothing but the beginning of terror." Would you say this line was illustrated when Sophie heard Haydn's Creation at Auschwitz, and when you, in Darkness Visible, heard, quote, the honking of the Canadian geese over the blazing foliage, and both were immediately overwhelmed by horror? If so, could you possibly explain to us this line, "Beauty's nothing but the beginning of terror"?
I think that's a very good perception of certain aspects that might be embedded in my work. There is a scene in Sophie's Choice where Sophie, being the captive of the commandant, in his house at Auschwitz. If memory serves me right, she's been intensely aware of something that she ordinarily tries to block out of her consciousness, which is the fact that thousands of Jews are being incinerated and cremated not too far away from where she is. And at this moment, she becomes more aware of it. I think she begins to perhaps smell the smoke or something at this moment, out of a radio completely without any warning, just picked up on the frequency, so to speak. She hears from some station in Europe Haydn's Creation, several passages from this glorious affirmative redemptive music, and she dissolves into a hopeless grief and mourning for herself and for everyone else. And I think I did use that in a very deliberate way to underline the ghastly contrast in war as in life between these moments of beauty and horror, which we're all find juxtaposed against each other all the time. And it may be the secret of life that we are constantly in a counterpoised situation where the beauty we need and want is being obscured or removed from our consciousness by the horror of such things as war. And I think that possibly I did have a deliberate understanding of what Rilke was up to when I wrote that passage. Also, I might add that in Darkness Visible, there is no doubt about that one of my most vivid and horrendous memories, and I did use that passage in the book, was where, as I sank into this state of almost catatonic depression, I was taking a walk near my house in New England, and I saw this glorious flight of Canada geese, beautiful birds that usually fill me with awe and sometimes reverence, because they really are the personification of nature at its most glorious. But in this particular instance, they filled me with absolute chilling horror. And I realized that this was a signal for me of the onset of what I never euphemistically call more than anything but madness. So I think you're on to the right view of what I was up to in both of them.
Thank you. Yes. Professor Herbert.
What methods might American culture and higher education employ to break down the Japanese refusal to recognize their role in the common moral disaster of the Pacific War?
That's a very good question. I don't know, because in addressing this terrible fact as I did just now, I'm appalled by it, and it is, if anything, reinforced almost daily by knowledge I glean from articles I read, and from a recent trip to Hawaii, which I took only a month or so ago, in which I encountered the Australian writer I just described, Gavin Dawes, and he curled my hair with a description of going to Japan and meeting so many members of this rigid amnesiac population, including intellectuals, who simply will refuse to accept the fact that the Japanese were profoundly culpable in their conduct of the war at the most gross and atrocious level. I don't know what the answer is, but I think we just have to hope that they don't erupt in some future consolidation of militarism of some sort. I wish I had an answer to that.
Colonel,
Semper Fi, Mr. Styron. It has been a privilege. This is my last panel that I will participate from. So it's been a privilege for me as a professional military officer to be on this platform with you three gentlemen. Your stories are compelling. Your books are compelling. Your personal testimony to what you did for our nation is a compelling one for the next generation that has been part of the military for the last 30 years. The lessons that the three of you portrayed in your works are lessons that professional military people today, 1997, still study, because we know we don't want to repeat those lessons that you and your colleagues paid such a tremendous price to achieve. My question, I have two questions. The first one is probably an easy one. The second one is perhaps a little bit more of a reflective question for all three of the panelists. The first question is, why did you write Sophie's Choice? My reason for asking that question, a close personal family friend was Frau Augusta Huber Besch, who became the mother in the movie The Diary of Anne Frank. She had a tremendous history as one of the leading actors of Europe in the 1930s. And because of her stature, she was able to provide the Gestapo with a list each Christmas of Jews that she wanted saved from the Holocaust. She told me this story for hours one day at her pool in Mount Kisco, New York. And she said, I tell you this story for one reason. Do not let this happen again. Why did you write Sophie's Choice?
Well, I've never been able to discover the source, the wellspring of anything I've written in a way that I could be totally explicit. I can't really just say why, but I can offer suggestions. By saying this, soon after I got back from the Marines, I went back to my, what became my alma mater, Duke University. And I was finishing up my last year, and I encountered a book called Five Chimneys. Now, Five Chimneys was written by a woman doctor right after the war, a survivor of Auschwitz named Olga Lengyel. And she described, I read it because I was, I suppose, idly interested in the Nazi concentration camps. I mentioned this in my talk, that the word Holocaust is really never passed into the American language until 1979, at the occasion of the rather dreadful TV miniseries called Holocaust. But as dreadful as it was, it did allow the word Holocaust to pass into the language. Previous to that, most people, including myself, merely referred to the Nazi terror or the concentration camps or something like that. At any rate, this book was a horrendous graphic description of Auschwitz, and it never, ever left my consciousnness. It was not terribly well written, but it was beautifully done as a record of the horrors of Auschwitz, including and especially her arrival at the camp with her son, her little boy, and her mother. And while she did not have to make a choice or anything like that, she did have to make a decision about what she wanted the child to do in response to the SS doctor. And she made the mistake of miscalculating, and instead of having him saved, he was taken to the gas chamber along with her mother. that is her own mother. And this was graven on my memory. It's just it was, as I say, it was right after the war, and I began to realize very gradually what the Nazis had been up to. And time passed. I went to Brooklyn after I graduated from Duke to the rooming house that I memorialized in Sophie's Choice, very much the way it happened to me. And there I met a beautiful, somewhat older young woman who called herself Sophie, who had a tattoo on her arm, who said she was from had been to Auschwitz. Her English was still very, very fractured and difficult, but we managed to communicate. And I think I fell sort of halfway in love with her, although it was hopeless because she was probably 8 or 9 years or 10 years older than I. Still very young, but when you're 21, a 31-year-old lady is an old lady, let's face it. Sorry about that. But at any rate, whatever our attachment was, she was extraordinarily attractive, and I was smitten by her, and I had to leave the house. I didn't stay there very long. I stayed there for about 6 weeks, and then for one reason or another left, said goodbye to her, and never saw her again. And in the middle of the 1970s, after I'd written several books, including the Confessions of Nat Turner and others, I was floundering around in the middle of the 1970s trying to deal with a subject matter that I felt was beyond me. And one morning, I don't mean to make it sound like a psychic experience, because it wasn't, but one morning I woke up with a vivid recollection of Sophie Zawistowska, my Polish phantom from many, many years before. And I suddenly put that together with the memory of Five Chimneys and the ordeal of Olga Lengyel. And I said, I've got to stop writing what I'm doing and sit down and write this story. What I must do is to write a semi-autobiographical narrative which will combine Sophie with a narrative leading up to revelation, as in Sophie's Choice, of an Olga Lengyel who had to make a terrible decision about her children. And in this way, I will be able to do something which I felt was necessary to do, which had not been done, because at that point, there had never been an American novel, a work of fiction, seriously dealing with Auschwitz, with the concentration camps. And because it, I think, spiritually and ethically dovetailed with my obsession, which I might add still continues, about why human beings dominate each other, why we live in a world in which domination seems to be the name of the game. If I could do with Sophie what I had done, in effect, on another level with the racial thing and slavery, then I would be accomplishing something I desperately wanted to do. So that was the genesis of the book. And then I sat down, it took 4 years, and it was published.
You had a second question?
Yes, thank you for that candid response. My second question, I had lunch with an ambassador from one of the Southeast Asian nations 3 years ago in Washington. He'd been the ambassador from one of these countries for 25 years. And I said to him, what will you tell your grandchildren about the United States? And he thought for a second, and he answered with one sentence. His words were, freedom without responsibility is destroying one of the greatest nations in civilization. What will you tell your grandchildren about the United States that you worked so hard to defend 50 years ago?
Go ahead, folks.
I can't even imagine having grandchildren, so.
That's a good question, though. Kurt will answer it. He usually answers most of these questions.
No, I'm completely flummoxed by the question, and I have many grandchildren. It's interesting. At a session last night, I asked Mr. Heller if he was, as a war veteran, the Second World War, if he was disappointed by what had become of the United States. And I believe you said that, it seemed quite logical what had happened, for good or ill. It was ordinary evolution. And my feeling is quite different, as I'm very sorry to have my grandchildren born into such a country where nothing seems to matter but money. Who was the guy who said we were being wrecked as we were a swell nation? The feeling I've had is that Jefferson and Madison and our founders depended on our being good citizens. Thought that under such a benign, fair-minded Constitution, we would behave decently. And so I see people like Larry Flint, as I'm a First Amendment absolutist, but I would have paid to have him shot because he put the First Amendment in such terrible danger, because we want it in order to criticize those who are in charge. And these nuts at the head of corporations are in control of treasuries of corporations, finally deciding it's theirs, taking it all. So Jefferson was foolish to expect us to behave decently. Nor did he, being a slave owner, may I say. And I'm sorry, Bill, as you probably think he's God.
No, I don't. I don't think he's quite God, but I think he's a marvelous man. He's far higher in my estimation, obviously you, but...
Two possible answers to your question. The one is that the analogy with the ambassador from Asia is not an accurate one, because we assume that our grandchildren will know about America from having been here and growing up. The second thing is that despite my cynical, skeptical, and pessimistic outlook about so many things, I remain an optimist. And some of the things that give me hope is, one, this discussion and your question. And the second thing is that because we do have freedom, we do get books like Sophie's Choice and Catch-22 and Cat's Cradle and the others. So there is a general movement toward commercialism, I think a general deterioration in public ethics. On the other hand, there are people like you and like the three of us, and I think almost everybody in the audience, who are repelled by it and would like to make things better, and to a certain extent, perhaps we can. In answer to the first question, I do think there are innocent people, and if there are degrees of responsibility, they vary in degrees in a war situation. Certainly, I don't think you would disagree with me that the children in Dresden and the children in Hiroshima were innocent and were in no way connected with the war effort. And I think in working up from that, you can get degrees of responsibility. There is a difference between civilians and combatants, and I think in a general way, what I find repulsive, and most decent people do, is that civilians have become acceptable objects of attack in a war situation. This has happened in the past, certainly in the Bible and the Greek history. Whole populations were slaughtered, but it has not been acceptable, I think, generally acceptable in Western thinking until World War II.
Yeah, I think that could be emphasized by the by the treatment, for instance, of civilians during our own Civil War. It's an amazing phenomenon. My grandmother, who was a 12-year-old little girl in eastern North Carolina, when nearly around about the time when the Civil War began. We lived on a plantation in Hyde County when a contingent from General Burnside's regiment, which was controlling that area, swept down on the plantation, destroyed it, leveled it, and took off all the slaves, 30 slaves, including the 2 little slave girls that she herself owned. And I remember when I was a little boy listening to her tell this story. And one of the interesting things is that it reflects a lot of the conduct of what went on among the combatants of the Civil War, which is that although they would destroy property, and slaves were property, they would confiscate property like slaves, they would never touch civilians. There have been whole books written about this question, the issue of the treatment of civilians during our own Civil War. And it's an amazing story of almost universal gallantry on both sides. Civilians were not allowed to be touched. Occasionally there was an atrocity or two, but they were swiftly reprimanded and sometimes executed. And I think that what Joe is saying is a very, very interesting historical fact, that in the intervening years between our own Civil War and modern warfare, the total world was changed when it came to the treatment of civilians. And it's an extraordinary moral judgment against the human race.
Helen Osborne? No, Helen.
You've explored some of the revisionist thoughts on Hiroshima, and I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you think our perspectives on the Holocaust may have changed over the last 50 years.
Well, I think it's interesting that although it was generally known in America, the details and the horror of the Holocaust was a known fact ever since the first Army newsreels, which were widely disseminated right after the war, showing the corpses being shoveled into pits and the other details, plus the trial at Nuremberg, which brought out every detail that could be brought out. What amazes me is, and I'm there almost as a witness, is that in these intervening years between 1945 and, let's say, 1980 or 1979, when Sophie's Choice was published, there was relatively little interest in the Holocaust in America. It was a known fact, but the books were few and far between. There were 1 or 2 novels published not by Americans, but by Europeans, one being The Last of the Just by André Schwartz-Bart, and one being a book called Treblinka, a novel by Jean-Francois Steiner. These were the only 2 significant works of fiction about the Holocaust in all the years between 1945 and 1980 or 79. And I don't claim to be the watershed book. That is, I don't claim Sophie for that title, but it is amazing that there has been this snowballing effect in the last 10 or 12 or 15 years in which every detail of the Holocaust is now at our disposal. And the only answer I have to that, and it's just a supposition, is that the Holocaust, the effect of Auschwitz and its cohorts in crime, the other camps, was so profoundly traumatic to the human consciousness that is something that people wanted to keep buried for a long time and successfully did. And until finally, like a boil or an abscess that bursts. It finally had to burst, and it burst within a very few years, around about the time we're talking about just now, in the last 5, 10, or 15 years. That's all I can say about that extraordinary amnesia effect between 45 and now.
Edith Jonathan?
Given the changes in our country and in our culture in the last 50 years, how do you perceive your role as novelist has changed? Do you feel that it's changed, your part in the cultural conversation that's going on?
You asking
All of you.
All of us, gentlemen?
I'll begin bashfully. I never had a conception of my role as a novelist. The word role is the one that I never thought. I wanted to be a novelist, and I wrote novels, and that's pretty much what I wanted to do. And what went into my novels was very much a part of me, my moral thinking, my unconscious psychology and conscious psychology. I don't, in fact, in talking to novelists, I might be contradicted by these two. I've never heard anyone express a sense of a role or an obligation or a function. At the same time, I'll admit that novels do have an effect on people, but I've never tried to measure or define that effect.
The point is, what he did was to, in Catch-22, was to fulfill the edict, once again, of that intuitive genius, Herman Melville, who said simply, and I'm quoting, "To write a mighty book, you must have a mighty theme." And this is the secret. I don't mean to say in any pompous way that people must seize great themes to write great books, but in fact, paring that down a little, that is what writers do when they are working at the fullest measure of their talent. And someone like Joe Heller, whether he knew it or not, when he wrote Catch-22, was writing a mighty book because he had a mighty theme. And the mighty theme was the absolute lunacy and absurdity of warfare, which had never been dealt with in this country, or for that matter, any other country, with such deftness and with such wild humor. He touched a nerve that had to be touched, and that, I think, answers your question about what the role of a writer is to find the secret nerves of the society and pluck them, or exacerbate them, or make people angry in the act of dealing with those nerves.
Just elaborate a little. You mentioned earlier, discussed, you talked about that paper which was actually dealing with the movie version of Sophie's Choice, and I had in mind that also, that perhaps because the image is so important now, that our work as writers has less of an impact on people. I don't know. I just wondered what your opinion was.
Well, I have nothing against movies. I rather like them, but there's a world, and we're going to have a whole seminar tomorrow, I gather, on this subject. There's a world of difference between the image as the revealing medium and the printed word. You simply can't do the same thing with the moving image as you do with the printed word. And of course everyone's concerned about the disappearance of writing, the flattening out of the written word, sacrifice to the image, to CD-ROMs and all those things. But still, we still live in a society where millions of books are being produced and read. And ultimately, I'm like Joe, I'm an optimist about things, and I think that despite the threats, the written word will survive. It's survived so far, and I think it still will. They were saying this, after all, you know, when talkies appeared in the late 20s, they were saying no one will read a book after the people learn to talk in the movies. Well, look what happened. Unfortunately.
Well, we've been deprived of a function, which is reportage. is of the three of us, I think I'm the only one who set out to be a journalist in high school, as I knew I was going to want to be a journalist. And so my books have been more reportage. But novelists used to show people parts of the world they would never see for themselves, introduce them to interesting characters, marvelous characters, you know, as most people couldn't travel much. As my dentist has been to Tierra del Fuego, I haven't. And so we are no longer a source of information. And if we watch Geraldo Rivera this afternoon, he will have 5 Madame Bovarys on. And they will tell in their own words how their lives, how they'd been brought to the brink of suicide by looking for true love. Is tomorrow they will have 3 men. Well, as they found them, they scouted them out. One is Seattle, one is from Tampa, not far away from here, and the other one's from Toronto. These men get up every day and put on full suits of armor and walk around town trying to make other people behave chivalrously. The next day, there will be guys who are crazy about catching world record fish. And unlike Moby Dick, we'll see what their wives are like, because they're along as what it's like to be married to a guy. Anyway, we're no longer useful.
I may return to the panel momentarily, but I wanted to see if there's anyone in the audience here who wishes to. We have a microphone right up here. If you'll please go to the mic.
He didn't need the microphone from where he was sitting.
I was on Luzon in August of 1945. I also was in Manila when the veterans of Corregidor and Bataan were being processed back. I want to say that I experienced the same ecstasy that you expressed and that everyone around me did also. With maturity and some growth, I shed myself of a sense of collective guilt. In other words, I don't blame a whole nation. But I think, and that ecstasy was expressed even though I was in a support group. I was in a signal construction battalion at a staging time. I was not in a direct combat unit. But I think that this business of revisionism, that those scholars would best serve us if they looked more closely at that window of opportunity that you talked about in that year when we have probably lost the peace. So that we may pick up the remnants of this mad continuum. This is not a question, and I hope it's not going to be a speech. I just want to make a further comment that you and your colleagues give my life sanity, and that you're not useless. And,
Thank you, I appreciate that.
You need to go to the microphone.
You should go in. Good, I've been watching her.
Before you ask, did you want to respond to anything?
No, thank you.
Hi, I would be interested in getting your reaction to Germany's more recent reaction to the Holocaust, because it seems that when I engage in debate with other scholars regarding the Holocaust, there's a certain animosity towards Germany's reaction, no matter which side they take, whether people perceive an amnesia or a denial of the Holocaust, that is seen as particularly bad and is criticized. But on the other hand, if they publicly acknowledge it and engage in some kind of mourning or remembrance of it, perhaps in the form of a memorial, that's also criticized because that's seen as you build a memorial and that's enough. And then you've provided some kind of closure or closed a chapter on the Holocaust. So given that there seems to be criticism levied no matter what the Germans do, I'm wondering what you would then see as perhaps the most appropriate form of remembrance or mourning of the Holocaust, or perhaps as a correlation to our own culture and what we could do better.
Well, I agree with Günter Grass that this is a wound which can never be healed. There are such things.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be ever a closure, whatever you call it, on the Holocaust, because it was the wound, and indeed it was, is too gaping. It's never going to be sutured. It's going to be constantly pulsing human blood as long as people have memory. I think that, I've only followed the controversy in Germany, not superficially, probably better than most, but I don't have a scholarly perception of it. But I have followed, to some degree, the reception of Daniel Goldhagen's book. It's a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners. And his thesis has been that the Germans, on every level, not just on the level of the SS or the Nazi apparatus or the Wehrmacht or the operators of the power, but on every civilian level, were conscious of what was going on and participated in the butchery to some degree or another. And what is fascinating is that this book has been a runaway bestseller in Germany, a huge bestseller, as no book in recent history has ever received the controversy of this, that this book has received, nor, curiously enough, such untrammeled praise and admiration. Goldhagen himself, who's a young scholar from Harvard, is parenthetically a very good-looking young man, and he's been moving around Germany like a rock star. He has been on numerous panels. The audiences are standing room only, and his message is received by the scholars, generally speaking, with praise and approbation. They say, yes, we believe too that our people, our fathers, because this is a new generation, did participate in this hideous enterprise to a degree that we have not accepted. And I might add myself, parenthetically, that when I visited Auschwitz and did whatever research I had to do there, I was struck by the extraordinary fact that most of the people who were in power at Auschwitz, that is, both enlisted men and officers, were not professional military people. They were civilians. In civilian life, they were butchers and candlestick makers and bookstore owners and streetcar trolley conductors and plumbers and maintenance men and all sorts of common, ordinary professions. And Goldhagen's book is an extension of that. And this has enormous implications when it comes to examining the underpinnings and the meanings of totalitarianism. Because if this is true, and I think it's true, and the scholars seem to think it's true, it means that all of us here are vulnerable too, that we could be participating in the rise, possibly, of some totalitarian state in some future day. And it's not going to be just the military establishment. It's going to be you and me and the butcher down the street and the plumber and the other avenue, and that sort of thing. So this is a very important discussion, which I think should not end, which should be that should be a continuing scrutiny of that open wound.
Could I ask you to ask your question at the microphone, please?
This incidentally ties in very directly with what I wanted to ask you, namely, to what extent is the common man involved in it? I'm from Yugoslavia, or what used to be Yugoslavia, and I'm very much concerned to what extent what happened there is a direct result of what happened in the Second World War. Because I have seen it evolve from the fascist state that Croatia was to Yugoslavia, which was quote-unquote tolerant of ethnic minorities, to the state into which it collapsed 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And where, of course, the beginning of the war was a direct retaliation to what the Croats did to Serbs at the beginning of the 1941. So it never ends, really. And also I wanted to connect it with what you said about how many Slavs were in the concentration camps. Slavs were definitely the Untermensch. And whether you know how many actually Slavs, perished in the, if there's any figures available or anything like that, of how many men perished, and to what extent you do see what happened there, what's happening there now in Bosnia and Croatia, Yugoslavia, as the result of what went on 50 years ago. Thank you.
Well, my own view is that you could regard the horror in Bosnia as being a part of a continuum that is really never-ending, that didn't just begin with the horrors of Auschwitz, but began with the total barbarism of World War I, which was the incubator, it seems to me, in the 20th century of this of our total disregard of humanity. I think if you look at warfare, it's a very subtle gradation between wars, but the one I mentioned about the Civil War being relatively benign in its attitude towards civilians is not an unimportant observation, and that the wars of the 19th century were different to important degrees in terms of attitudes toward conduct and toward behavior in warfare, different as opposed to the wars of this century, beginning with the incredible slaughter of World War I, which I think metaphysically was a watershed moment in human history, because even this American Civil War, which was barbarous beyond description, pales with the absolutely inhuman slaughter of World War I. And I think that became a benchmark for nihilism in the whole human race. I think after Verdun and the Somme and those extraordinary slaughterhouses of World War I, human beings sort of began to regard warfare as a natural part of the human condition. And it was proved to be such, because only 20 years later, after the armistice at Versailles, the Germans were marching into Czechoslovakia. And I think Bosnia is simply a part of that continuum.
And that's when Yugoslavia was created.
Yes, right.
Okay, well, one more question, and then we'll need to terminate our session for this morning. Right.
You all have spoken about the imagined moral responsibility in this country, and I would agree with that there isn't a lot shown anymore. How do you explain the collective guilt of this generation, my generation, for what happened in World War II with the collective amnesia of the other countries? Why do we seem to want to throw ourselves into it where no one else wants to accept it?
I didn't hear the question.
Sense of collective guilt that we have here, as opposed to collective amnesia, perhaps in Japan, mentioned by Mr. Styron in Japan.
I don't think there should be any such thing as generational guilt. My grandmother, actually, it's amazing to me, had slaves. She was a little girl when she owned them, but I can't believe it still that I'm connected that close to slavery. But I have no guilt about this. And I think guilt is a corroding and harmful emotion, a harmful substance in the emotional bloodstream. Responsibility is needed instead of guilt. And I think it is our responsibility as a nation in our educational process to be intentionally aware of what we have done to others and what our barbarous conduct has created in places like Vietnam and other places. You know, without being smug about it, Americans have been pretty good at this, examining our past and the misuses of it and the injustices we have perpetrated throughout the world. It's helped, I think, check us from being a worse nation than we are on certain levels. All the more reason why, again, I'm playing the old tune again, why it's alarming that the Japanese simply do not seem to be capable of the same introspection.
Thank you. And I think because our distinguished guests have a date with the public broadcasting system, I'm going to end our session and express our gratitude to Mr. Styron and his colleagues.